welcome everybody. I am Catherine. I am was the reference manager at the Central Branch of J. Morrell. We had a little confusion on our start time between 5:30 and 6, so we're going to split the difference. We'll begin in just a few minutes with introductions, but we're going to give everybody who believes that it starts at 6 just a moment more to show up. And we're going to put some more seats out, but if people can cozy up, that will help as well. Thank you all for coming, and we will be right back. Stay tuned.
If you haven't got a copy of Chesapeake Requiem or one of Earl Swift's books, we have some in the book room right beside. After the program, you're more than welcome to purchase a book, and the book signing will be in the room. There's a room on your way in that looks like it's completely empty, but now there's a beautiful tablecloth picked chair. Thank you very much. Was that coherent? Did everybody get it? Okay, thank you. We're putting more chairs out.
Check 1, 2.
everybody. How is everybody doing? Good, good, good. My name is Kalela Williams. I am the director of the Virginia Center for the Book and the Virginia Festival of the Book. So thank you all so much for coming. We are also here with, we are so excited to again be partnering with the James-Madison Regional Library System for their Same Page annual event. We're so lucky that we have this partnership and so grateful for them. So thank you all again so much for coming to this event. This is our 31st Festival of the Book, and so you might have noticed some changes. I appreciate everybody's patience as we try out our registration system. This really helps us as a festival grow to be bigger and better, and to better count how many people are coming, how many people are here, and to really show our sponsors and funders that we are here, that we've got folks here, and that we are doing amazing work. This really helps. So I know that it's been a growing pain, and I appreciate you all growing with us. So thank you. We are going to get started. The Virginia Festival of the Book is, of course, a program of Virginia Humanities, which is our state council of the humanities. Every state has a humanities council, and this is ours. So thank you so much. And I'd like to thank our premier sponsors, Michelle and David Baldacci, who helped make this event possible. I wanted to ask that you all silence your cell phones and take a look at the exits. Make sure that you're aware of your surroundings. As always, if you see something, say something. And if there's anything that happens, we have site coordinators on hand who will be helping out with that. So just, again, be aware of your surroundings as always. After the panel, please consider, as Nancy Damon mentioned, please consider getting a book, getting 2 books, getting 5 books, I don't know, however many books you want. Get them all. Like Pokemon. But please consider getting books for yourself, for other folks who might be interested. Please don't leave with empty hands. Take a book with you if you haven't already gotten a book, because I know that the JMRL Library has given out so many free books. So with that, I'm going to introduce Catherine Fay from the JMRL Library System. And again, thank y'all so much.
Welcome, everybody. We're so thrilled that you're here. And again, I'm Catherine. I'm with the JMRL system. And I'm going to just introduce our authors and our Same Page event. Our author tonight, of course, is Earl Swift, and our moderator is Elizabeth Mather. And I want to thank everybody for coming out. Do please stay afterwards for signing with Earl, which will be right down the hall. We'll have people directing you where to go, but he'll be staying as long as needed to sign your books. And I want to recognize the JMRL Friends of the Library and our partner Festival of the Book for making this event possible, as well as our author Earl and our moderator Elizabeth for taking the time to celebrate JMRL's 2025 Same Page Community Read. Every year we work with Festival of the Book and the JMRL Friends of the Library to highlight a celebrated author and distribute free copies of one of their books throughout the JMRL service area. And then we offer free programs and events at each branch throughout the month of March, which are related to themes presented in the book. So you can attend. Some of our branches still have programs ongoing for the rest of the month. This year, Same Page Community Read features Chesapeake Requiem, a year with the Watermen of Vanishing Tangier Island. Earl lived on the island for nearly 2 years and spent the 6-month peeler crabbing season on Tangier, joining its watermen on their boats and absorbing their long-standing customs in order to write this book. We are deeply appreciative and thank the Friends of the Library for supporting the Same Page Community Read for the last 7 years. And I hope that you will enjoy the conversation tonight, as well as Chesapeake Requiem. Please do visit your local JMRL branch and attend some of our amazing programs. We look forward to seeing you there, and thank you again for your time and support. So tonight, I want to introduce our author, Earl Swift. He is author of a number of books, and Chesapeake Requiem was New York Times bestseller and named to 10 other bestseller lists. And his newest book, of course, is Hell Put to Shame, an Edgar Award nominee. Definitely worth picking that up tonight. he was a Fulbright Fellow, a 5-time Pulitzer nominee, and a PEN finalist. His other books are Across the Airless Wilds, an autobiography, The Big Roads, Where They Lay, and he, along with Elizabeth, were former reporters for the Virginia Pilot. He was for 22 years. He's a contributor to Outside magazine and other publications, and a fellow of the Virginia Humanities at the University of Virginia. He is local. He lives in the Blue Ridge Mountains just west of Charlottesville, which has been an extra treat to have him visit our local branches. And Elizabeth, our moderator, is the Assistant Vice President of Marketing and Brand Strategy at UVA. She has 30 years experience in communications and was a compatriot of Earl at the Virginia Pilot for decades. They served together and are really excited to have this opportunity to have a conversation about his book tonight. So with that, I will turn it over to Elizabeth and to Earl. Thank you so much for coming.
I didn't mean to.
All right. Thank you all so much for being here tonight. We're super excited to talk actually together and to you about this wonderful book. And we will get started with the conversation, but then open it up to you all because we're thinking that you probably have a lot of questions and want to ask some things for yourself. So Earl, do you want to start out just by talking to us a little bit about, how the origins of the book and how you got started with Tangier Island and it came onto your radar?
I can do that. Thank you so much for coming out tonight, especially with the traffic. This is the small town traffic capital of the world, and I spent about 30 minutes, supposedly 5 minutes away. So I can only imagine you went through the same thing to get here, and I really appreciate it. We really appreciate it. This book had a long gestation that I guess really began in 1999 when my editors at the Pilot assigned me a story that they had come up with themselves around a conference table, which is always the kiss of death. Anyone who's worked for a newspaper or a magazine knows that if the idea for a story originated in the building, it's going to be painful for all involved. And in this case, the editors had somehow dreamed up a story about how Tangier was faring 11 years after the Virginia lottery had come into being, and Tangier being one of, if not the only town in Virginia that had outlawed the lottery on moral grounds. The problem was that it was the 11th anniversary of the Virginia lottery, and nobody marks the 11th anniversary of anything, But for whatever reason, probably because they had just overlooked it the year before, they thought it was a good idea. They knew that I was interested in the bay. I was a kayaker, so I spent a lot of time in the water. And so they sent me to Tangier. So a photographer and I went up there. We spent one night, probably spent a total of 6 hours talking to islanders and trying to engage them in conversation about the Virginia lottery. And, it became amply clear really quickly that not one of them had given a thought to the Virginia lottery over those 11 years. They had no interest in talking about that at all. But they did have another subject that they wanted to talk about. And again, I heard about this existential dilemma that the island faced, that the bay that had sustained the place for 230 odd years at that point was poised to wipe it out. And they were very conscious of this. And as you can imagine, they were filled with existential dread about it. So I interviewed them, and I went back to my editors, and I said, there's really not much to this Virginia lottery story, but there is this other thing going on Tangier. And my editor said, that does sound like a pretty good story, but go ahead and write up the Virginia lottery story anyway, and then we'll talk about the other story later. So I did. Later that year, Y2K loomed large over everything, as you'll recall. And the paper fanned reporters out throughout the state, throughout the whole East Coast, really. And for whatever reason, they, in addition to sending reporters to places that were likely to really experience crisis if there was a technological meltdown, they also sent me to the most analog pixel of America that there was, which was Tangier, which had just gotten phones, relatively recently, and electricity too. And so I wound up going to Tangier, which is a dry island, by the way. And I spent the quietest millennial celebration that anyone in America experienced, and tried to get them talking about Y2K. But they did all want to talk to me about this, the existential dilemma that they were facing, that this bay was coming up and it had torn their island asunder. They had lost 2/3 of the island's landmass since the Civil War. Many of the old timers on the island could point to places where they had played or lived as kids, and they were 200 yards offshore, out in the middle of the water. The island was just breaking to pieces. And so I went back to my editors, and I said, there's really just not much to this Y2K story, but there is this other thing that everybody there wants to talk about. And they said, well, yeah, that does sound like a good story, but go ahead and write up the Y2K story first. So I did. And then about 3 months later, my editor shocked me by coming to me and saying, that story that you talked to us about sea level, or about global warming, which is what we were calling it at the time, erosion. Go ahead and do that. Spend some time. And so a photographer and I went out to the island, and we spent 6 weeks on and off, did a big package of stories that ran in June 2000. And I was pretty pleased with the stories. And I figured, okay, it's been done. I've done that story as well as it can be done, at least as well as I can do it. And so I walked away and left the newspaper a few years later, started writing books, writing for magazines, got busy doing other stuff, and 15 years went by. And in the meantime, I lived in a couple of places on the water in Norfolk. And with each northeaster, with each high tide, it seemed, the water would creep farther and farther up my yard, and also farther and farther up the walls of my basement. And for whatever reason, the Norfolk firefighter who had built my place in 1949 had put a basement in it, despite the fact that it was right on the water. But anyway, I was down in the basement, waist deep in water, trying to get the sump pump fixed during a northeaster at one point, and it had occurred to me, if things are getting this bad in Norfolk, they've got to be getting pretty dire out on Tangier. And so I kind of resolved at that point to get back out there. And on Christmas Eve of 2015, took the mailboat over and stepped onto an island that was profoundly changed. It was obvious from the first few minutes that I was there that it was a place that had undergone a great deal of land loss since in the 15 years since my last visit. Now at high tide, the water didn't just come up over the edges of the island. It percolated up right through the soil and made lakes of everybody's yards. It topped it came out of the salt marsh that makes up 80% of the landmass there, and flooded the roads. And that had not been going on in 2000 when I was there. And there were more profound differences that became obvious the longer I was there, but I saw those in the first 10 minutes. And so that's a long answer to a short question, but there you go.
And I do remember your Y2K story.
I wish I'd done it.
So in your book, I think you said it's something like 4 generations in before they consider you an actual local down there. I mean, kind of a population that's very closed in and to some degree perhaps skeptical of strangers coming in. So I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about what it took for you to kind of get yourself ready to stay there and get folks to embrace you for what you were trying to accomplish.
Well, once I realized, again on that trip, on that Christmas Eve trip, it became. Pardon me. Let me see if I'm probably holding it too far away. Is that better? Okay. I realized on the Christmas Eve trip to Tangier that things were moving at a gallop, and that if I wanted to write about it, I couldn't wait. I had to do it pretty doggone sooner. There wouldn't be an island to write about, and so I wound up making arrangements to move there and took up residence in mid-May of 2016, and then lived there basically for 14 months. Um, in the first 6 weeks I was there, or so, about the first month and a half, all I did was show the flag. I went to every baby shower, wedding shower, coffee clatch in the afternoon, after church social, went to church like 4 times a week. Went everywhere I could find people gathered, just to get them used to me being around, because it is a very insular place. I mean, it's one family, essentially. Everybody on Tangier, everybody born on Tangier, can trace his or her lineage back to one couple who moved to the island in 1778, Joseph Crockett, and unfortunately his wife's name has been lost to history. But those two have, they've spawned everybody who's there. So everybody on the island is a cousin or closer, and they can spot you pretty easily if you're not if you're not an islander. And the whole Eastern Shore is pretty insular anyway. That whole come here, born here, come here thing applies to Accomack and Northampton counties as well. You can move to Accomack, when you're 3 months old, and you will never be born here, never. It's crazy. Your kids can be there and have a tenth of the time invested in the place, but they'll be born here, and you'll always be a come here. Tangier, over the years that the island has avoided winding up with everyone looking like the British royal family by bringing in outsiders as breeding stock on occasion, But and so and to tell you the truth, physically they're beautiful. They're really good-looking people. Eventually the all fried food diet kicks in, and that they kind of pop like a popcorn kernel. But until that happens, it's like an island of supermodels running around. It's a little weird. Anyway, where the heck was I going with all this? I've lost track of the question now.
Well,
How did I get them to? Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
that I just showed the flag, and what I found was that rather than playing fly on the wall by trying to hide the fact that I was a fly, I had better luck just advertising it. I carried my notebook with me wherever I went. I always made sure that I had it out and apparent, and that if I was talking to somebody, I was writing down what they said, and I wanted them to see me writing it down, because I wanted no ambiguity as to whether we were on the record. We were always on the record, and after a while, that approach paid off. It's not that I became invisible; it's that they stopped caring about the fact that I had my notebook out. Everybody on the island has a role to play, to keep the place afloat, so to speak. And my role over time became, I was the guy writing the book, and they became less and less wary as time went on.
so when you were approaching that task, I just wonder what the values were, or just say the mindset that you had that was important to you in terms of faithfully representing them.
I guess I went into it knowing that they had grave doubts about the existence of climate change, and I had no doubts. And so before I began, I had to kind of sit down with myself and get comfortable with the notion that I wasn't there to plumb my ideas. I didn't. Nobody cared what I thought about climate change. I was there to find out what they thought about it and why. And and of course to record the end times, to be a witness to how they went about their daily lives with this existential, with this cleaver hanging over them. And I don't know if that gets to the question, but
Yeah. I think that sense of objectivity is really incredible that you brought to it, and it just comes out in every page of the book, really.
well, I'm not sure that I would even couch it as objectivity so much as what I tried to do was give them the space to explain themselves, to correct the record when necessary, but to do it respectfully. But mostly, just to treat them decently. I guess that's one of the things I went through kind of a typical evolution as a newspaper reporter. I started out covering beats and covering hard news and covering the cops first, which is kind of a rookie beat generally. And your mindset when you're a hard news reporter is it emphasizes speed, getting it first, and you're willing to push anybody out of your way to get to the story and to get to it first, and to get it accurately. And I found that the longer I was there, especially when I started going into long form writing, my emphasis shifted, and it became really important to me to treat people decently. And sometimes the stories that I wrote were, they stung the subjects of the stories. But I figured that if I performed my work decently and treated them decently, then no matter how bruising the story might be, they could at least appreciate the fact that I had tried to treat them as human beings. And with Tangier, I found that pretty easy to do. I mean, that for one thing, they're very decent people. They really are. I mean, this is a theocracy for all practical purposes of old school Methodism. When we're talking Lorenzo Dow, pre-Civil War shouting Methodism, this isn't the kind of Methodism that we have here in town. Bears no resemblance to it whatsoever. I can only imagine what it's like for a pastor, because the Methodist Church rotates people every couple of years. It's like being in the military. I can only imagine what it's like being a pastor in Charlottesville and then in your next assignment winding up on Tangier, where everybody, you better be up to speed on your scripture because everybody on that island is. And I think it's a real challenge for some pastors just to be as familiar backwards and forwards with the Old Testament as their congregation is when they get to Swain United Methodist. It's a tough room.
Amen. So I want to delve a little bit into something that's really characteristic of you and your writing and your technique, and that's how you get at detail, as a real reporter in the scene when you haven't actually been present at the time that the scene occurred. And so there are a couple of examples in the book. There's one where you were talking about Asbury Pruitt, who was the first to chronicle the erosion, actually in a scientific kind of way, or sort of scientific way. And you talked about him hammering an iron post into the sand. And then later, the very, very sad scene of the boat sinking. And you talked about how his son, Ed Charnock, who died in that boat sinking, his son Jason and he were in the water, and you gave very vivid detail about Jason looking at his father across an 80-foot expanse of water, and basically the last time he saw his father. And I just wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you do that, because it's an incredible technique.
It's reconstruction, and it's if you write long form, eventually you have to reconstruct a scene like that. And I got lucky. It depends. It depends to a tremendous degree on having an eyewitness available. You know, because you're not there, you need to talk to everybody who was. And in the case of the sinking of the Henrietta C in chapter 22. But just so that I know what I'm dealing with, how many of you guys have read the book? Okay, cool. Well, about half. So at the very end of the book, and I hate to spoil it for those who have not read it, but very, very near the end of the book, penultimate chapter, there is a boat sinking that takes down a storied skipper, a captain, on the Tangier crabbing fleet, who goes out every day with his son. His son is his mate. And, the son survived and the dad did not. And the son, as you can imagine, was completely gut shot by this experience, was incapable of thinking about it, let alone talking about it for months after it happened. And I had written, when I wrote the book, I was approaching my deadline, so I wrote a plug chapter, just or what do they call it on Wikipedia when it's just a stub? I wrote a stub, basically, for chapter 22 and explained to my editor that, I don't know whether I'm going to be able to replace this with anything down the road, but let's just use it as a stub for right now. And if I can get Jason, the son, to talk to me, I may be substituting something a little bit more detailed down the road. And so, the sinking happened in late April of 2017. It wasn't until early October that Jason felt like he could talk to me. And I got him for one day, talked to him for about 5 hours, and I had been aboard the boat, and I had been aboard plenty of dead rises, so I had the general familiar, the deck plan pretty well situated in my mind. I had photos of the boat from the past that I could draw on. I had talked to his dad on numerous occasions over 17 years. He was one of the people I originally thought might be one of the main characters of the book. And he was so laconic that I eventually decided I couldn't have him as the main character because he didn't say anything. A really interesting guy and viewed as probably the best mariner on the island. But, getting a word out of him was like pulling teeth. And so finally I gave up and did not use him as a main character. So I had all that, and then I had stuff like the Coast Guard, accident report, which was very, very short. And I had the eyewitness accounts of every able-bodied man on the island who had gone out trying to rescue them, especially Lonnie Moore. But if I had not gotten that 5 hours with Jason, it wouldn't have added up to that chapter. I would not have been able to write that story. I would have stuck with the stub because they were the only two people on the boat, and all the really hairy stuff happened just to them. And anyway, he talked to me, and I would get him as he recounted a scene. I would stop him, and then we'd go back through the scene in greater detail, and then I'd stop him again, and we'd break it down into little bits, and I'd have him go over each of those little bits in greater detail, and then I'd stop him again, and we'd go over each of the bits, and I'd have them, have him break it down until the detail we were talking about subatomic detail, basically, and it was, millisecond by millisecond, the recounting of the really intense scenes of that sinking. And I don't think he's talked about it to anybody since. It took its toll. 5 hours is a long time to sit for any interview. My usual stopping point is 2.5 at the max because I get tired. I stopped being an active listener after a while. But I knew, in that case, I had him for one shot. And I could pretty much guess that even if he did sit down for a second interview, it wasn't going to be as good as that first one. That was the time that counted. And I handled him as gently as I possibly could. We sat in his living room on the sofa. His kids were playing around us. Wife brought us iced tea and stuff, and he stuck it out. And no matter how much detail we talked about, he stayed with it. So.
It's an incredible scene, and it gets me to kind of another technique question for you, which, and this goes back to when we were working together years and years ago. I remember sitting around a lunch table with a bunch of people, and somehow the story came up that you, at the time, this may be apocryphal, but there was a story that you would wake up in the middle of the night and suddenly remember a word you had been trying to recall all day long for your writing, a crisp, fabulous, clean word for your writing. And as I read your writing now, it's like every word is your baby. And so I just wonder if you could talk a little bit about word choice for you. Am I getting that right? I mean, how much time do you sweat over the word?
Oh, yeah, a lot. Uh, you know, I believe that good writing is deliberate writing, that no word winds up on the page by accident. If you have stuff that's winding up on the page by accident, by magic, then you're not doing it right. You know, the idea that you sit around waiting for inspiration, complete BS. You know, that's just garbage. This is as much left brain as it is right brain. There's engineering as much as there is art to it. You bolt together sentences, and consequently, every word in your sentences has to be load-bearing. They have to be load-bearing components of that sentence. Every sentence has to be a load-bearing component of the paragraph it's in. And so I sweat that a whole lot. I used to be, and I kind of wish I still were to some extent. I used to be somebody who could throw down words on the page, and if I had time, come back and clean it up. You know, when you're working on a deadline with news, that's how you have to do it. And I can't do that anymore. You know, I can't throw it down and just walk away from it. I've got to like fiddle with it until it's exactly the way I want it. And then the next day I'll come by, you know, I start every day reading what I wrote the day before, and I find that it's nowhere near as perfect as I thought it was the day before, you know, when I left it. So I fiddle with it some more, and, you know, and the same thing happens the next go round through it. I'll always find stuff to fix. So it's, but the deliberate part is the important thing. I think you know, this notion that writing, that you're just a vessel for the writing, and that you know, comes from some mysterious source and winds up on the page. You know, I'd be starving if I depended on inspiration before I sat down to write anything. I think every writer would be, every musician would be. You know, you you get inspiration in the course of the day's work. It comes to you as you're working. But if you sit around and wait for it, then it'll never show up, and you'll never write anything. So,
So, what's happening on Tangier now, and who are you? Are you still staying in touch with anyone?
yeah, stayed in touch with Lonnie Moore for a good while. He developed early onset, a form of early onset dementia, and so I still am in occasional contact with his wife. But Lonnie has been sidelined. Still in contact with Uker. Uker and I were born on the same day of the same year. We're exactly the same age. And if you want a refutation of horoscopes, you need look no further, because we are as different as two people can possibly be. But we get along really well. We agree on nothing, but we get along well. And stay in touch with him. And the situation is even more precarious than it was when I was there. It's not only has, you know, the sea level rise continued in an accelerating fashion, but the demographic collapse has really sped up. They're down well below 400 people now, and they're reaching those tipping points where the essential municipal services that really enable life to continue on the island, you know, those tipping points where that stuff's really imperiled, where they will get to the point where they lack the headcount to support that stuff, and like the school, like the mail boat, which despite its name is not a government operation. It's a family business that's been in the same family for 4 generations. Like the sewage treatment plant, its operation is financed with an assessment on each household, and as the number of households decrease, the assessment on each becomes more and more burdensome. And this is a hand-to-mouth kind of place. This is not a Nantucket fishing village. This is a working waterman's town, uh, and barely making it some years. And it's got that look to it. Uh, so all of these operations are teetering. The grocery store, the grocery store, if it lacks the critical mass of customers, it's come very close to going belly up in the past, and it's barely hanging on. So we're barreling towards the point where the weather might, the sea level rise might not be the thing that does the place in. The human collapse, the human erosion might outpace the natural erosion.
Are they still hoping for some kind of rescue, do you think?
Yeah, I think that they have faith, being a theocracy. They have faith that there will be a divine intervention of some sort. This is, Tangier is it's situated in the smack in the middle of the widest part of the Chesapeake. You've got about a 30-mile width to the Chesapeake right there, and it's a sitting duck for every storm that comes up the bay. And so throughout its history, Tangier has been hammered pretty hard by weather. It's been laid low by epidemics. It's had all sorts of disasters visited on it over the last 240 years. And it's been staggered by a lot of them. There's a cholera epidemic in the 1840s that laid it low, but it didn't quite wipe it out. There was a measles epidemic that laid it low, didn't quite wipe it out. Typhoid came and went. Number of hurricanes, the unnamed August storm of 1933, hit it hard. I mean, lifted big boats, by boats, up out of the bay and dumped them on the main street in the middle of Meat Soup, the business district. Flooded houses up to the second floors. It was a miracle that anybody was able to survive it, let alone want to stick it out there, but they did. And each of those cases, they believe that they were spared complete annihilation by the power of their prayer. That they're an anointed people, anointed by their prayer. And you don't hear them talk about it explicitly, but it's pretty clear that they see their current dilemma as another in a series. And, in this case, divine intervention may take the form of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, but they're going to see it as divine nonetheless.
And what do you think the Army Corps direction might be on that?
That's the one constant in Tangier is dealing with its erosion problem with sea level rise has been the very slow pace of the response by officialdom in general, but by the Army Corps of Engineers in particular. And that's not a slap at the Corps. The Corps has a protocol for dealing with, big public engineering projects and spending the public's money. And it's really rigorous about, what it requires of a project before it jumps in. And Tangier has never made a good case for itself against those measures. And it's a really small place, and it's really expensive to try to save it. So you wind up with there's you can't even call it a proposal. There's a concept that the Corps has kind of sort of floated. It hasn't gone up the ladder very far, but this concept is that they would save Tangier by preserving it as a wildlife habitat for the Atlantic flyway, and maybe save the town as kind of a collateral side project. But if they did that, it would cost $800 to $900 million, and you're looking at a population that by that time may be down in the 200s. So, you try to sell that to Congress, and Congress is likely to say we could spend a dime on the dollar and buy everybody on Tangier a $300,000 house on the mainland. Why would we, rebuild an island? And valid question.
And you've talked about it as a bit of a canary in the coal mine in terms of the types of decisions that we're going to have to make as a society. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, this is really the kind of the, I guess the most important point in the book is we've got 88,000 miles of coastline in the United States, and not all of it's going to be imperiled immediately, but a good chunk of it's going to be imperiled, by the end of the century. And we're going to face the decisions we face and what to do about them, much as we're facing those decisions with Tangier. And it's going to get really ugly, really, really, really ugly when we have to decide. We can't save all of them, but we simply can't save all of these places that we're talking thousands of towns that will be imperiled. So we have to come up with a rubric, a series of characteristics that a place that we are willing to save should have. And head count may be a big, that's kind of the easiest one. It's a no-brainer that you're going to try to save a Miami or a New Orleans or a New York. But it gets a lot tougher when you start looking at small places that mean a great deal to us in terms of culture or history. Places like Jamestown. What do you do with Jamestown? Hardly anybody lives there. And it's always been imperiled by sea level rise. Long before we even knew to call it sea level rise, Jamestown was disappearing under the water. What do you do with a place like that? How do you save a Jamestown and not save a Tangier? So this rubric has to be pretty detailed. It's got to talk about, okay, we're gonna, we hold these things to be important to us as a people, and then we've got to stick to it. Because if there's one thing that will keep society from completely unraveling, and maybe the only thing, this has to be applied fairly. It has to be applied consistently. The second you lose consistency, all hell breaks loose. So, on the one hand, I really hope Tangier gets saved. But as I say at the end of the book, I'm not sure it should. I don't know what that does in terms of our ability to apply the lessons that we use here to the next project. Because there is a next one. It's not far down the road. The western shore of the bay is already going underwater. Matthews County is sinking into the bay even as we speak. So right behind Tangier, we're going to see this repeated over and over and over again, and it will happen. It'll happen quickly. One of the mistakes science has made has been to couch this whole problem in terms of by the end of the century. The bay is going to be 2 feet, 3 feet deeper, higher by the end of the century. Well, no, the bay is going to be plenty higher in 20 years, and that's how you have to think about it. This is not a straight line on a graph where you can predict accurately, when you need to intercede. It's a parabolic curve. It gets worse as it goes and accelerates as it goes. So this is something we need to be talking about now, not at the end of the century. We should probably
Get to the Q&A.
if
My
you guys
thoughts
have any
exactly.
questions.
Do we have a microphone for the group, or?
Catherine, do we have a spare mic? Oh, okay.
We're going to bring a mic so that everyone can hear the questions, and we'll start with you because your hand shot up very quickly. Okay, well,
But
let's see if
it's
this
for everybody
gentleman's
else
loud.
that we need your. That's
You
why
want to
we need it.
stand up and?
But we can repeat.
I'll repeat the question. You want to stand up and start, and then we'll go to you.
Reading this book in 2025 in the context of how we're all living, what's going on in the book, it just seems to me that this is a cautionary tale that you've written about.
We'll repeat it.
I'll repeat the question.
About reducing the number of people who are involved in making of these existential decisions, whether it's at the engineer level or at the Corps of Engineers or nationally or internationally. And I'm curious if you believe that the story you've written
question, which I'm not going to be able to repeat in its entirety, but I will try to summarize. You tell me if I get it right. But looking back at the book now in 2025, published in 2018, 17, as a harbinger of what was to come, is it does it give us sort of a roadmap or lay a foundation for the way we need to think about these things? Did I represent that?
And also, I guess, yeah, does it argue for including as wide a swath of humanity as
Right.
possible in making the decision?
solutions.
And of course, yes. I mean, that's exactly what it argues for, and that's what I believe is essential, because I don't think you get to that fairness in building the rubric unless you have everybody who's a stakeholder, at the table. And it certainly makes it messier, but that's the only way that you can guarantee, fairness, but basic fairness and consistency, it seems to me, in building a rubric that'll last for as long as we're a species on this planet, because that's pretty much how long it's going to have to last.
Thank you. Okay, and I promise this gentleman here, we've got a let's get the microphone to you.
So the book doesn't seem to have mention of two things, and I'm curious if you could reflect on what your experience was. One is television, and the other is gardens. There was no mention of people having gardens.
Well, at one time there were quite a few gardens on Tangier. They basically had a subsistence lifestyle, and they grew everything that they ate. Two things have changed that. Well, three things. Number one, the population has aged. It skews way old now, Tangier. When I was there, the average age was about 62, and that's the average. And you had 3-year-olds on the island too. So I mean, there were a lot of 80 and 90-year-olds, on late 80s, 90s on Tangier when I was there. Now, COVID eliminated a good chunk of that population. Sad to say, but as the population aged, you saw a lot of people, or a lot fewer people engaged in gardening. The other thing is that it's a soggy place. The water comes, as I said, percolating up out of the ground. It's salt water. Brackish on a good day, really salty a lot of the time, and nothing grows. That's why they lost all their trees. There are very few trees on Tangier now. It used to be heavily wooded. They've all been killed by salt water. And the other thing is, as a huge piece of the population disappears every day for the entire day. They go out in their boats, and so the island becomes a ghost town. That leaves the women on the island to run everything, and the women really do run Tangier. It is a completely run. The church, although the male elders would never admit to it, women run the church. Women run the post office. Women run the school. Women run every single business on Tangier. The place would collapse in a heartbeat if the women decided they'd had enough and left. There would be no Tangier. And so, frankly, I think that the people you do have on the island during the day who could be gardening are so task-saturated with other stuff, they just have no time for it. And the other big thing is there's a Walmart in Pocomoke City, and it's easy to get to by boat. And it has removed a lot of the impetus for getting out there and growing your own. Television. Well, there is, they have satellite TV, so everybody has either dish or direct. There's no cable. There's no cell phone service, so you're pretty limited technologically. Kind of iffy internet because it's also all satellite based, and the weather plays hell with it. I did not lose TV too much while I was there, but a lot more than I do on the mainland. And I live in Afton, where we lose power and TV quite a bit. So.
Okay, yellow shirt right there next to you.
From a psychological and sociological aspect, how do you think if the people of Tangier were moved to the mainland because Tangier was no more. How do you think they would adjust?
Well, that's, that's one of the, that's a question that you hear, a variation on that question you hear raised a lot. What if, part of the problem with relocating Tangier is, of course, it's one family, and they're all related. And so they will tell you that there's no way they're going anywhere unless they go en masse. Now, the problem with picking up the entire population as a block and moving it somewhere on the mainland is it's got to be close to the water. It's got to be on the bay, because that's the only livelihood, that they know. And your problem then becomes, well, any place you put them on the Chesapeake Bay, they're going to encounter exactly this problem like 20 years down the road, 30 years down the road. So you're just kicking the can a little ways. So it's not so much how would they adjust, it's what would be the point.
Celebration of the worker, maybe?
In many ways, a celebration of workers. These are workers, hard workers. And can you talk about their relationship to the crabs? And they didn't take the last crab. There seems to be they're sustainably harvesting the crabs. Can you talk about the work?
I would totally disagree.
I think they go for every last crab they can. Their attitude is that those crabs were put there by God to be harvested by them.
Why are the crabs still alive?
Well, you've only got so many Tangier, but you've got billions and billions of crabs. So the numbers game has kept the crab alive, but it isn't for lack of trying by the Tangiermen. Believe me, they would love to just eradicate the species, if they could. It's
Hello. So I know you mentioned in the book during the 2016 election, like people's opinions on Trump at the time. And now that we're, a few months into his term, I was looking at the election maps in Virginia, and Accomack County still voted red. Do you know if any perspectives or like any opinions have shifted there because of like the lack of basically doing anything lately, or is it still kind of the same as it was in 2016?
Now, when I was there for the 2016 election, and Tangier voted 88% for Trump. There were 27 Islanders who did not vote for him. They have kept their heads low. No one knows who they were. I know who 4 of them were, but I'm sworn to secrecy. If anything, they've become more entrenched. Based on, and I'm Facebook friends with an awful lot of Islanders, and if I post anything even remotely political online, they're all over me, and pretty unpleasantly so at times. It'll be interesting to see if anything down the road knocks them off that position, but so far nothing has.
Let's go to the back here because we had some folks,
I'm just curious if you've spoken to anyone that has read the book from Tangier and what their thoughts were about it.
Well, when the book came out on August 7th, 2018, I made arrangements to do my first reading on Tangier. And the reading was 4 days later on the 11th. And my daughter, who's in the back of the room right now, had great trepidation about me going back to the island because she had read the book, or she knew the manuscript was pretty warts and all, and that there was plenty in there that Tangiermen might not particularly like. And she was afraid that my visit might end the way The Wicker Man did, if you've seen that movie. So, but my attitude was I had to go back to Tangier. I had to make that. Of course I did. So I went back to Tangier. My girlfriend and I went over, and they had an event. They held it in the combination auditorium cafeteria of the school, and they packed the place. And I did my usual, discussion of the book, and then I did some reading, and then we opened it up for the Q&A, which was the dangerous part of the evening. But instead of asking questions, well, first of all, for the first person who stood up, it became obvious that not only in the 4 days since the book had come out, had pretty much everybody in the island read the doggone thing cover to cover, but they knew it almost as well as I did. I mean, they had read it closely, and they had discussed it among themselves. You know, this was a very energized audience I had. And but instead of asking questions, they all stood up, and it was like going to church there. They offered testimony about the book and about me, and there were tears. It was electrifying. I've never been through anything like it, and it was an amazing evening. And the general gist of their reaction was that there was plenty in the book that they would rather have not seen there, especially regarding the splits in the church. The 1946 split, still real thin-skinned about that. And then the 2011 split, there are still people who won't talk to each other over that one. But none of them could refute anything in the book. They felt that it had accurately described the place as they knew it. So I took that to be a good review. So.
So Tangier has a neighbor to the north, Smith Island, that you wrote about a little bit in the book. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what's happened to Smith in relation to what's happened to Tangier.
Smith Island is in Maryland. It's 6 miles. Its southern edge is 6 miles north of Tangier's northern edge. And the water between them is so shallow that at low tide you can actually walk it. But the Smith is much bigger. It's like Tangier. It's 80% salt marsh, maybe more. And like Tangier, all of its houses are crowded onto little what they call ridges, which are ridges only in the broadest sense of the word. I mean, they're inches above the salt marsh, but they're solid ground. They're high and dry anyway, and you can build on them. And Smith it's had a very different experience. It's a lot easier to get to. It's only 6 miles out of Crisfield, and the entire passage is protected. It's protected by Smith, which blocks the winds coming from the west. So as you pull out of Crisfield and you head west, you've got this landmass that blocks the wind. Whereas if you're headed to Tangier, you go out to Smith and you hook a left, and then you're in open water for 6 miles, and that is a wild carnival ride on some days. So you've got this much bigger island, much bigger landmass on Smith, and the population, which is only about half of Tangier's, is split among 3 little villages. And as the houses have emptied, what you've seen happen on Smith, because it's bigger and it's got more time and because it's easier to get to and it's safer to get to, you've seen that the empty houses that have been vacated as people die and leave have been bought up by folks in Baltimore and D.C. as weekend homes. You don't see that on Tangier. It's just too much of a crapshoot to get to the place that and it's going so fast that no one wants to invest in a sinking, shrinking island. And so it's, I guess the bottom line is it's got a lot more time, at least as places in the Bay are concerned. Its population is in free fall, just like Tangier's. It's got a federally managed wildlife management area just to the north of it, and they've rip-rapped quite a bit of that and built seawalls around that quite a bit, which armors the harbor, at least in Ewell, and which is the biggest of the 3 towns. But it's considering they're really close neighbors, the Yarnies and Smith, they have it pretty easy. Yes, sir.
Earl, I just want to say thank you very much for being here and going through this book again with us. It's terrific to have you here and to hear, this is a pretty poignant story you're telling. For my reading, the chapter about the sinking of the crab boat was an incredibly poignant event and an poignant telling. I'm curious, this is a kind of a fine-scale question, but I'm curious what rationale you gave the son for needing or wanting to do the interview, and what rationale he had for finally telling the story.
Great question.
Yeah, no, I had met, there are a lot of what ifs whenever you meet somebody in terms of whether or not you get off on the right foot, and whether you have a chance as a journalist to establish a rapport with somebody. And Jason Charnock is a great example of that, because about a week before the Henrietta Sea went down, I was headed off island, and it was a really, really windy day. So windy that the captain of the mailboat decided he wasn't going to run it. The boat sits so high up out of the water that he just didn't want to deal with the rocking and rolling that were going to come. So everybody who was due to leave town that morning on the mailboat had to walk from the mailboat dock in downtown Tangier over to the city dock, where Mark Haney and the evening boat dock, and Mark Haney took the mailboat's run that day, a much smaller dead rise. And while we were standing there freezing out on the edge of this dock waiting for Haney to show up in his boat, I saw this youngish Tangier, he was 40, standing there, and he looked familiar, but I couldn't quite place him. So I said, "Who are you?" And he said, "I'm Jason Charnock." And we got to talking, and I asked him the same question I ask anybody on Tangier who I met, which is, who are your folks? Because at that point I had memorized the family tree well enough that I could place them in relation to everybody else I already knew if I knew who their parents were. And he said that Ed Charnock was his dad, and I said, "Eddie Jacks?" And he said, yeah, Eddie Jacks," and he laughed. And had I not had that conversation, Jason Charnock would not have given me the time of day when I later came to him and asked about it. Because when I heard about the sinking, I had gone home, made another trip home. I went home about once every 3 weeks or a month for a weekend to cut the grass, answer the mail. My daughter ran the household while I was away, but she needed relief from that every now and then. And so I'd go home for a few days. And I had just gotten home on a Monday, and went on Facebook, and Carol Moore, an Islander, had just posted, pray for Jason and Eddie Jacks. And I think there was a photo of the Henrietta Sea that was part of her posting. And that was it. It was just pray for them. So I was thinking, what the heck is this? And so I sent her a quick message, and she told me, they're missing. At that point, they were still out there. Every other man on the island was out looking for them. There was no word as to what had happened to them at that point. So I immediately left and went back to the island. Got back there that night. Next morning, went over to Annette and Eddie Jacks's house. Of course, by now, we knew that Jason had survived, and the odds were very long against Ed having survived by this late juncture. And went over, and I knew Annette. I'd run into her several times at that point, and she invited me into her house. And Jason was standing on the stoop outside her front door, and he remembered. I didn't have time to introduce myself. He remembered me from the end of the city dock. He goes, "Oh, yeah," and he turned to Annette and then recounted our conversation from the city dock. So then he was A-okay with me coming into Annette's house and sitting with him and her as they received the Islanders coming to their door throughout the day. And so I spent several hours there with them. And then, I told him right off the bat, when you're ready, I'd like to talk to you about what happened. Because, again, everybody knew I was there to write a book. And it was apparent to everybody that this would be an important part of the book. But I didn't know whether he'd be able to actually, participate. It just wasn't clear to me. He was in a state of profound shock that afternoon on the sofa in Annette's house. And so I really couldn't gauge whether he was going to be in any shape at any point in the foreseeable future to talk to me. Now, that stub that I wrote, sorry, but my grandson's back there in the middle of the aisle pointing at me. Say hi, Dawson. um, the I've been derailed by cuteness. Yeah, I know. I know. I'm trying to think of it. Initially, when I decided I'd just put the stub in place and hope for the best down the road, I got into a conversation on a completely different subject with my editor at Outside Magazine shortly thereafter. And I mentioned to him that I was working on, trying to piece together the details of this boat sinking in the middle of the Chesapeake Bay. And he said, you ought to pitch the magazine. That sounds like it could be a good story. And so I thought, okay, well, I'll do that. And the magazine agreed that it was a good fit for Outside. And so what I arranged to do was go ahead and finish the book. The book was due on October 1st. That was my deadline, October 1st, 2017. I'd immediately after I met that deadline, go back to the island and report the story for Outside. That story was due on November 1st, so I had a month to put together the Outside story. And then I'd take that Outside story and try to rejigger it to make that the new chapter 22, to replace the stub. And so that's what I did. And I told Jason when we talked on the phone when I was trying to schedule when I should come back in October to do all this reporting for Outside. I said, look, I'm going to be coming to do two things. I'm going to, clearly I have to write about what happened to you for the book, but Outside Magazine also wants a story about it. And, they'll be essentially the same stories, but, this is the chance to really tell your dad's story to a big audience. And he was okay with that. He agreed to it. I think he wanted the story out there. I don't think he wanted to belabor it. So I think the advantage to talking to me that, in October of 2017 was that he only had to have the conversation once, and then he was, he could be done with it. And I tried to write the story so that he would be done with it once.
Well, at this
I hope so, because Eddie Jacks was a pretty remarkable guy. I mean, I remember when I was there in 2000, I talked to him while I was building crab pots. He was clipping zinc bars onto the chicken wire, and they all put zinc on their crab pots to keep them from, the electrolysis of salt water getting to the metal, and the most amazing things kept coming out of this guy's mouth. He sounded like the Ancient Mariner, it was straight out of Coleridge, and so at one point I was talking about how, well, you must know everything about the blue crab at this point. He'd been crabbing for 50 years during this conversation, and he goes, nah, I don't, basically that he didn't know anything. He said, the only thing anybody knows about the crab is that she'll run from you and she bites. That was, I love the fact that he said she. I just thought it was just such a weird, phrasing. And so when I went back to Tangier for the book, Eddie Jacks was one of the people I assumed would be a main character. And like I said, he was so laconic, I couldn't use him. And so when he died, I found myself now with a book that did not mention him. And suddenly he dies at the end of the book. Well, you can't have that. And so I went back and had to rebuild pieces of the early going of the book so that Eddie Jacks would be introduced early and then would be a continuing thread throughout the narrative. Not a in-your-face thread, but would never leave the very back of your mind all through. And so, for instance, the wedding scene where you meet Eddie Jacks. The wedding scene was not in the original first draft of the book. I had it in there, and I had Eddie Jacks in there, and then I decided to cut Eddie Jacks as a main character, and I no longer had any reason to include the wedding scene, even though it had great color. Um, I figured it just didn't earn its keep. It wasn't load bearing enough, and so I cut it. Um, and so I went back in and backfilled the manuscript after his death, so that you would establish some familiarity, some relationship as a reader with Eddie Jacks right at the beginning, and take that through. And it's a terrible shame that it took his death to earn him a place in the book, and that's no reflection on him as a person or as a mariner. He was a pretty terrific guy, from what I could tell, and no question he was one of the best ship captains on the bay. I mean, unmatched. It's
Earl, what's your next immersion?
my next immersion. Well, I just finished through hiking the Appalachian Trail for a second time, and so I'm writing about that. The first time I hiked in 1990, I was a southbounder. Let me tell you, just for those of you who might be thinking about a hike, it's a lot easier to do it at 31 than it is at 65. It's a hell of a lot easier. It kicked my butt pretty severely this time, but the first time I did it, I met a couple up in New Hampshire and hiked with them for several days, and then pulled ahead of them. And a couple months later, they were murdered in Pennsylvania, and so trying to resolve that is one of the reasons I did it again. Really, I wanted a do-over, and so that will be a thread of some sort in the book. I don't know what.
Well, at this point, we have reached beyond our time, and we could probably all sit here all night and have this conversation. It's wonderful. So thank you for all of that wonderful description and insight, and thank you all for your fantastic questions that helped us bring more out. Want to encourage everyone to buy the next one, Hell Put to Shame, and be ready for the Appalachian Trail book to come out.
Thank you so much for coming.